The following documentation provides an exhaustive analysis of the high-stakes confrontation between United States Senator Tom Cotton and Rodney McMullen, the Chief Executive Officer of the Kroger Company. This interaction serves as a cornerstone for understanding the current ideological friction between federal legislative bodies and the leadership of major American corporations regarding religious liberty. The dialogue specifically addresses the nuances of employment law and the limits of a company's power to enforce cultural conformity within its workforce. It examines the fallout from a legal dispute in Arkansas that resulted in a significant financial penalty for the grocery giant. The tension throughout the transcript is rooted in the fundamental question of whether a private entity can mandate the display of symbols that violate an individual's conscience. This inquiry explores the philosophical underpinnings of corporate branding versus the constitutional protections afforded to the American worker. The narrative begins by focusing on the specific circumstances surrounding two elderly employees who had served the company for many years before their termination. These individuals found themselves at the center of a national debate after refusing to wear a specific company-mandated apron feature. The heart-shaped rainbow emblem was at the center of the controversy, as the workers interpreted the design as a direct endorsement of LGBTQ+ pride movements. Their refusal was not born of malice but of a deeply held religious conviction that prevented them from advertising a lifestyle contrary to their faith. The company's decision to terminate these employees rather than provide a simple accommodation led to a federal lawsuit. This legal battle eventually concluded with the company being ordered to pay a $180,000 settlement to the affected parties. During the hearing, Senator Cotton pressed the CEO on why a more conciliatory approach was not taken to preserve the employment of these long-term staffers. He pointed out that the workers had requested to simply cover the logo with their name badges or a small piece of fabric. This request was denied by local management, which insisted on total compliance with the new uniform policy. The senator characterized this refusal as a rigid and unnecessary escalation that prioritized a corporate aesthetic over the lives of dedicated employees. He argued that the refusal to grant such a minor request indicated a lack of genuine respect for religious diversity within the organization. The CEO, however, maintained that the uniform was a critical component of the company's Feed the Human Spirit initiative. Rodney McMullen defended the branding by suggesting that the rainbow heart was intended to represent a broad sense of community and kindness rather than a specific political or social agenda. He framed the logo as a tool for fostering a welcoming environment for all customers regardless of their background or personal identity. From the company's perspective, the uniform was a non-negotiable aspect of the brand's public-facing persona and a symbol of its commitment to inclusivity. The CEO argued that allowing individual exceptions to the uniform policy would undermine the consistency of the brand's message. This defense centered on the idea that the corporation has the right to define its own values and require its employees to reflect those values while on the clock. The senator found this explanation insufficient, viewing it as a thin veil for ideological enforcement. The exchange grew increasingly pointed as the discussion moved away from the specific lawsuit and toward the broader internal policies of the retail chain. Senator Cotton introduced evidence regarding the company's internal training materials, specifically those related to allyship and inclusive communication. These documents reportedly encouraged employees to move away from traditional gendered language in their interactions with customers and colleagues. The senator questioned why a grocery store was involving itself in the linguistic habits of its workers, particularly regarding common terms of respect. He noted that the discouragement of terms like sir and felt like an overreach into the personal speech patterns of everyday Americans. This part of the interrogation aimed to show a pattern of behavior that favored progressive social engineering over traditional cultural norms. As the inquiry deepened, the focus shifted to the perceived double standards in how corporate sensitivity is applied to different groups. Cotton argued that while the company went to great lengths to avoid offending certain demographics, it showed a blatant disregard for the sensibilities of Christian employees. He suggested that the corporate culture at Kroger had become hostile to those who hold traditional or conservative religious views. This hostility, he argued, was not just an incidental byproduct of new policies but a deliberate shift in the company's mission. The senator's line of reasoning suggested that inclusivity was being used as a buzzword to justify the exclusion of those with traditionalist beliefs. He posited that the company was essentially telling religious workers that their values were no longer welcome in the modern workplace. The broader context of this debate involves the rise of environmental, social, and governance (ESG) metrics that many corporations now use to guide their operations. Critics like Senator Cotton believe these metrics have turned businesses into political actors that often side with the left on cultural issues. The CEO was asked to explain how these social goals aligned with the primary mission of serving customers and providing value to shareholders. McMullen stayed firm in his position that a company's social impact is intrinsically linked to its long-term financial success and brand reputation. However, the senator argued that this approach actually alienates a significant portion of the American public who just want to buy groceries without being lectured. This clash highlights the growing divide between the C-suite executives and the Main Street consumers they serve. The transcript reflects a significant moment in the woke capital debate that has permeated American politics in recent years. This term is often used by conservatives to describe large corporations that they believe have become overly concerned with progressive activism. The hearing served as a platform for Cotton to voice the frustrations of many constituents who feel that their values are being erased by powerful economic entities. He sought to demonstrate that the Kroger case was not an isolated incident but part of a systemic trend across the Fortune 500. By highlighting the $180,000 payout, the senator emphasized that there are real-world financial and legal consequences for ignoring religious protections. This financial detail was used to underscore the gravity of the company's failure to accommodate its staff. Furthermore, the discussion touched upon the psychological impact on the employees who were forced out of their jobs after decades of service. Senator Cotton spoke about the dignity of work and the importance of allowing people to maintain their integrity while earning a living. He painted a picture of two elderly women who were essentially bullied by a multi-billion-dollar corporation over a small piece of plastic. This narrative was intended to humanize the legal dispute and frame it as a David versus Goliath struggle for individual rights. The CEO's corporate speak was contrasted against the personal stories of the workers, creating a stark visual of the divide between leadership and the front lines. This emotional appeal was a key strategy in the senator's attempt to delegitimize the company's policy. The interrogation also explored the role of human resources departments in shaping the ideological landscape of modern companies. Cotton suggested that these departments have become the enforcers of a new social orthodoxy that leaves little room for dissent. He questioned the training methods used to instruct managers on how to handle religious accommodation requests, implying they were inadequate. The CEO defended his HR team, stating that they strive to balance the needs of the company with the rights of the individuals. Yet, the evidence from the Arkansas case suggested a breakdown in that balance, as the management failed to see the merit in a simple compromise. The senator argued that the system is designed to favor the corporate mission over the individual's constitutional right to free exercise of religion. As the first segment of this analysis concludes, it is clear that the conflict between Senator Cotton and Rodney McMullen is emblematic of a much larger struggle. It is a struggle for the soul of the American workplace and the definition of what it means to be an inclusive employer. The details of the Kroger lawsuit provide a concrete example of the friction points that occur when corporate branding meets personal faith. This transcript serves as a warning to other executives that their internal policies are being watched closely by those with the power to legislate. The focus on religious liberty is not just a legal argument but a cultural stand against the perceived encroachment of secularism in all areas of life. The upcoming sections will further dissect the implications of this hearing for the future of corporate-government relations. The senator's closing logic for this portion of the debate centers on the idea of reciprocity in the political and economic spheres. He suggested that if corporations want to be treated as neutral actors in the eyes of the law, they must act as neutral actors in the culture. By taking sides in the culture war, companies are essentially inviting political retaliation from those they have offended. This perspective shifts the responsibility for the conflict onto the corporations themselves, suggesting they have abandoned their neutral ground. The CEO's attempts to frame the issue as one of brand unity were met with skepticism by a lawmaker who sees it as a move toward ideological homogeneity. This fundamental disagreement sets the stage for a deeper exploration of the legislative consequences that may follow such high-profile disputes. Cotton's rhetoric was carefully crafted to resonate with a base that feels increasingly marginalized by the institutional power of the private sector. He utilized the Kroger case to build a broader argument about the necessity of protecting traditional Christian values from being phased out of the public square. This strategy involves framing the defense of these workers as a defense of the American way of life itself. The use of the $180,000 settlement figure was a repetitive theme used to ground the ideological debate in hard facts and legal reality. It served as proof that the company's actions were not just morally questionable to some, but legally indefensible in a court of law. This legal validation was crucial for the senator's argument that the company had overstepped its bounds. The interaction also highlighted the different languages spoken by the two participants, the language of corporate management and the language of populist legislation. McMullen spoke in terms of branding, spirit, and culture, while Cotton spoke in terms of liberty, accommodation, and discrimination. This linguistic gap reflects the deeper cultural chasm that exists between the urban executive class and the more traditional populations of states like Arkansas. The hearing was as much about these competing worldviews as it was about a specific uniform policy or a linguistic guideline. It provided a window into how the leaders of major industries are being forced to justify their social policies to a skeptical and increasingly assertive political class. The tension remains a defining feature of the modern American political economy. Moving deeper into the interrogation, the dialogue transitioned from the specific legal failures in Arkansas to a wider examination of the allyship guide distributed to the Kroger workforce. Senator Cotton meticulously deconstructed the language contained within these corporate manuals, arguing that they represent an unprecedented attempt to sanitize the natural vocabulary of the American public. He specifically pointed to the sections that discourage employees from using common gendered honorifics, which have long been the standard for polite service in the United States. To the senator, the discouragement of sir and was not a move toward inclusivity, but rather a direct assault on the cultural etiquette and linguistic traditions of his constituents. He posited that by forcing employees to abandon these terms, the company was essentially requiring them to adopt a specific social ideology that many find alien or even offensive. McMullen, on the other hand, framed these guidelines as a response to the evolving expectations of a diverse customer base, suggesting that the goal was simply to avoid unintentional offense. The senator's critique focused on the inherent contradiction of a company that claims to feed the human spirit, while simultaneously policing the respectful speech of its staff. He argued that the spirit being fed was one of narrow political correctness rather than genuine human connection. The debate over honorifics became a proxy for a larger argument about the boundaries of employer authority over an individual's personality and speech patterns. Cotton questioned whether a grocery clerk should be subjected to disciplinary action or social pressure for simply being polite in the traditional sense. This line of questioning was intended to paint the corporate leadership as being out of touch with the reality of the people who actually stock the shelves and serve the public. The senator suggested that such policies create a sterile and uncomfortable environment where workers feel they are constantly walking on eggshells. As the second phase of the hearing unfolded, the discussion turned toward the concept of viewpoint neutrality within the workplace. Cotton challenged the CEO to provide examples where the company had gone to similar lengths to accommodate or protect the sensibilities of conservative or religious individuals. He noted that the corporate commitment to diversity appeared to be a one-way street that only traveled in a progressive direction. The senator highlighted that while the rainbow heart was mandated, other symbols of personal importance, such as those reflecting patriotic or traditional religious views, were often restricted or forbidden under the guise of uniform consistency. This perceived inconsistency was used to bolster the argument that the company was not seeking a neutral environment, but was instead curating an ideologically lopsided one. The CEO maintained that the company's policies were applied uniformly, but he struggled to provide concrete counterexamples that satisfied the senator's demands for evidence of ideological balance. The inquiry then shifted to the financial and political implications of these corporate shifts, specifically focusing on how they impact the relationship between the private sector and the government. Senator Cotton argued that when a corporation decides to become a combatant in the culture war, it forfeits its status as a neutral market actor. He warned that the political protections and favorable regulatory environments that businesses often enjoy are predicated on the idea that they serve the entire public without prejudice. By aligning with specific social movements and penalizing those who do not comply, Kroger was, in the senator's view, inviting the government to treat them as a political entity. This segment of the transcript reveals a growing appetite among lawmakers to use legislative and oversight power to curb what they see as corporate overreach. The warning was clear. The era of business as usual is over for companies that prioritize social engineering over their primary economic functions. Furthermore, the senator explored the internal mechanisms of how these allyship policies were developed and who was responsible for their implementation. He questioned the influence of outside consulting firms and activist groups that frequently grade corporations on their social performance. Cotton suggested that Kroger's leadership might be more concerned with satisfying the metrics of these third-party organizations than with the actual morale of their employees in Middle America. This critique strikes at the heart of the stakeholder capitalism model, which Cotton views as a subversion of traditional fiduciary duty to shareholders. He argued that by chasing high marks from progressive advocacy groups, the company was neglecting its duty to provide a stable and respectful environment for its diverse workforce. The CEO's defense of these metrics as best practices did little to bridge the gap between his management philosophy and the senator's populist oversight. The narrative also touched upon the psychological pressure felt by employees who find themselves in the crosshairs of these new mandates. Cotton described a culture of soft coercion, where workers who do not enthusiastically embrace the new corporate orthodoxy are marginalized or passed over for promotion. He suggested that the termination of the 2 workers in Arkansas was merely the most visible tip of a much larger iceberg of employee dissatisfaction. The senator's focus on the $180,000 settlement was not just about the money, but about the judicial finding that the company had indeed failed to provide a reasonable religious accommodation. He used this legal victory for the workers as a hammer to beat back the CEO's claims that the company's policies were legal and inclusive. To Cotton, the court's ruling was a definitive rejection of the company's attempt to place its branding strategy above the federal protections of the Civil Rights Act. The dialogue also delved into the specific wording of Kroger's loyalty and inclusion statements, which Cotton characterized as sounding more like a manifesto than a business document. He read aloud passages that he claimed were designed to re-educate employees on their social perspectives. The senator's tone was one of incredulity as he asked the CEO if he truly believed his customers in rural Arkansas or Ohio cared about intersectional allyship when they were trying to buy a gallon of milk. This appeal to common sense was a strategic move to frame the corporate policies as absurd and disconnected from the everyday lives of the American people. McMullen's responses remained professional and measured, yet they often leaned on corporate jargon that seemed to confirm the senator's point about a disconnect between the executive suite and the general public. In this portion of the transcript, the tension reached a peak when the discussion focused on the chilling effect these policies have on religious expression. Cotton argued that when a company explicitly endorses one set of social values, it implicitly tells those with opposing views to stay silent or face consequences. This creates an environment where religious employees feel like second-class citizens within their own workplace. The senator posited that this is particularly damaging in a country that prides itself on the freedom of conscience. He criticized the company for not recognizing that for many people, their faith is not something that can be checked at the door when they clock in for a shift. The CEO's insistence that the rainbow symbol was inclusive of everyone was met with a sharp rebuttal that it clearly was not inclusive of those whose faith prohibited them from wearing it. The exchange also highlighted a shift in how the Republican Party views the free market. While the party has traditionally been a staunch ally of big business, Cotton's interrogation signals a new willingness to challenge corporate power when it conflicts with social and religious priorities. He argued that the market is not free if the dominant players use their economic leverage to force social change that could never pass through the democratic process. This populist economic view suggests that corporations have a responsibility to the culture that sustains them, not just to their bottom line or their social activists. The senator's aggressive posture was intended to show that there are now political costs associated with what he termed corporate bullying. The second part of this analysis concludes with a look at the legislative threats issued during the hearing. Cotton hinted at potential changes to labor laws or corporate tax structures that could be used to penalize companies found to be discriminating against traditional values. He suggested that the legal protections that allow corporations to operate as a single entity could be revisited if they continue to infringe upon the individual rights of their employees. This represents a significant escalation in the rhetoric used against woke corporations. The CEO was left to defend a position that was increasingly being framed as a liability not just for his company's reputation, but for its legal standing. The transcript leaves no doubt that the battle over the American workplace is moving from the HR office to the halls of the United States Senate. Throughout this segment, the focus remained on the impact of these policies on the silent majority of workers who may not have the resources to file a federal lawsuit. Cotton positioned himself as the voice for these individuals, using the Arkansas case as a rallying cry for broader reform. He emphasized that the $180,000 paid by Kroger was a small price for the company, but a massive vindication for the workers involved. This narrative of the little guy winning against a corporate giant was central to the senator's messaging. It served to illustrate that the legal system still provides a pathway for redress against corporate overreach. The CEO's attempt to move past the settlement was repeatedly thwarted by the senator's insistence on using it as proof of systemic failure. The interaction also revealed the deep-seated mistrust that now exists between certain segments of the government and the leadership of the nation's largest retailers. Cotton's questioning was not merely an information-gathering exercise. It was a public shaming of a corporate culture he views as poisonous. He aimed to make the CEO the face of a movement that many Americans find deeply unsettling. By focusing on the specific details of the allyship guide, he made the abstract debate over wokeism feel tangible and immediate. The debate was no longer about vague corporate goals, but about the specific words a grandmother in Arkansas is allowed to say to a customer. This shift to the personal and the specific was the most effective part of the senator's strategy in this middle portion of the hearing. As we look toward the next stages of the transcript, the focus will likely shift to the long-term consequences for the retail industry if these ideological divides are not bridged. The hearing provided a preview of a future where corporate policies are subject to intense political scrutiny and where the definition of professionalism is a site of constant conflict. The tension between the CEO's vision of a unified, progressive brand and the senator's vision of a religiously pluralistic and culturally traditional workplace remains unresolved. This transcript provides a vital record of that clash, documenting the moment when the pressure on woke capital reached a boiling point. The repercussions of this exchange will likely be felt in corporate boardrooms and legislative chambers for years to come. In the third segment of this investigation, the discourse moves into the specific mechanisms of institutional pressure and the diversity, equity, and inclusion (DEI) infrastructure that critics argue has become a shadow regulatory system within the private sector. Senator Cotton intensified his focus on how these internal frameworks are not merely suggestions but are often enforced with a zeal that rivals federal law. He questioned Rodney McMullen about the origin of these mandates, suggesting that the drive to implement such policies often comes from elite echelons of management who are insulated from the cultural realities of the regions where they operate. The senator pointed out that for a company like Kroger, which serves as a lifeline for many rural communities, adopting a radical social stance is not just a branding choice but a form of cultural alienation. He argued that the spirit the company claims to feed is increasingly one that looks down upon the traditionalist worldview held by a significant portion of its customer base and workforce alike. This portion of the transcript highlights the senator's belief that corporate social responsibility has been weaponized to bypass the legislative process, allowing executives to impose social changes that would never survive a democratic vote. The senator then pivoted to the broader implications of the $180,000 settlement, treating it as a symptom of a deeper rot in corporate HR philosophy. He argued that the fact a lawsuit was even necessary to secure a basic religious accommodation proves that the internal culture at Kroger had become inherently biased against people of faith. Cotton noted that the legal threshold for reasonable accommodation is relatively low, and the company's failure to meet it suggests a deliberate desire to purge dissenting voices rather than a simple administrative oversight. He challenged the CEO to explain why the company was willing to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees and settlements, rather than simply allowing two elderly women to wear a name tag over a small logo. This line of questioning aimed to expose a perceived irrationality in corporate behavior, where ideological purity is pursued even at the expense of fiscal responsibility and employee retention. McMullen's responses remained focused on the importance of values-based leadership, a term that Cotton frequently dismissed as a euphemism for progressive activism. As the discussion deepened, the focus shifted to the chilling effect that such high-profile terminations have on the rest of the workforce. Senator Cotton argued that when employees see their colleagues fired for standing by their religious convictions, it sends a clear message: comply or be cast out. He characterized this as a form of corporate authoritarianism that seeks to dominate the private lives and thoughts of workers. The senator highlighted the psychological toll on employees who must choose between their livelihood and their deeply held beliefs, arguing that no American should be forced to make such a choice in the 21st century. He posited that this atmosphere of fear is antithetical to the inclusive environment the company claims to be building. The dialogue here touches on the fundamental tension between the collective goals of a corporation and the individual rights of the citizen, with Cotton firmly positioning himself as the defender of the latter. The interrogation also explored the role of allyship in the modern corporate lexicon, with Cotton dissecting the company's internal documents that define what it means to be a good employee in the eyes of the organization. He pointed to sections of the Kroger handbook that suggest silence on certain social issues is equivalent to complicity in systemic injustice. The senator argued that this compelled speech or compelled silence is a violation of the spirit of the First Amendment, even if it occurs within a private company. He questioned why a grocery chain felt it had the authority or the moral standing to instruct its employees on complex sociological and political theories. This part of the hearing was particularly focused on the disconnect between the mundane task of retail operations and the highly academic, often controversial, language used in corporate training modules. The CEO defended these programs as necessary for maintaining a modern, competitive workplace that can attract diverse talent, but the senator countered that they are instead driving away the very people who built the company's success. Furthermore, the senator brought up the issue of social credit within the corporate world, referencing how companies often perform for the benefit of ESG rating agencies and activist investment firms. He suggested that Kroger's management might be more afraid of a low inclusion score from a New York-based advocacy group than they are of a federal lawsuit in Arkansas. This critique suggests that the incentives for modern executives have been skewed away from the interests of their actual employees and customers toward the interests of a globalist, ideologically driven financial elite. Cotton argued that this alignment has created a ruling class of CEOs who are more loyal to their peers in Davos than to the people in the communities they serve. The CEO denied that outside ratings were the primary driver of policy, asserting that the company's commitment to diversity was authentic and homegrown, but the senator remained skeptical, citing the uniformity of these policies across almost every major American corporation. The third part of this analysis also delves into the legal strategy used by the company during the initial dispute, which Cotton characterized as aggressive and dismissive of the workers' rights. He noted that the company's lawyers had initially argued that the rainbow heart was a secular symbol and therefore not subject to religious objection. This legal maneuver, according to the senator, was an attempt to redefine the religious beliefs of the employees for them, which he described as a pinnacle of corporate arrogance. He argued that it is not the place of a multi-billion-dollar corporation to tell its workers what their religion does or does not prohibit. The court's eventual ruling in favor of the employees was presented by Cotton as a victory for common sense over corporate sophistry. He used this point to emphasize that the law still recognizes the subjective nature of religious belief and the duty of the employer to respect it, regardless of whether the employer agrees with the underlying theology. The discussion then turned to the impact of these policies on the brand loyalty of traditional consumers. Cotton argued that by alienating religious and conservative workers, Kroger was also alienating a massive segment of the American shopping public. He suggested that people are increasingly tired of being lectured by the brands they buy from, and that there is a growing movement to vote with the wallet. The senator warned that the long-term financial health of the company could be at risk if it continues to be seen as a partisan actor in the culture wars. He cited examples of other companies that had faced significant consumer backlashes after taking controversial social stances, suggesting that Kroger was on a similar path. The CEO maintained that his internal data showed broad support for the company's values, but Cotton dismissed this as the result of echo chamber management that ignores dissenting feedback from the front lines and the heartland. In a particularly sharp exchange, Cotton addressed the idea of microaggressions and how they are handled within the company. He noted that the guidelines for inclusive speech often list common phrases and behaviors as offensive, creating a minefield for employees who have lived and spoken a certain way for decades. The senator argued that this focus on microaggressions actually increases tension and division within the workforce rather than reducing it. He suggested that it encourages a culture of tattling and surveillance, where employees are encouraged to report one another for minor linguistic slips. This, he claimed, destroys the camaraderie and trust necessary for a productive work environment. The CEO's defense was that these guidelines were intended to foster empathy, but the senator countered that empathy cannot be manufactured through HR mandates and disciplinary threats. The transcript reveals a deep ideological chasm regarding the definition of respect in the workplace. For the CEO, respect meant creating an environment where no one feels excluded by traditional language or symbols. For the senator, respect meant honoring the conscience and the heritage of the individual worker, even if their views are not currently fashionable in corporate boardrooms. This fundamental disagreement is what made the hearing so contentious, as both parties were essentially speaking different moral languages. Cotton's use of the $180,000 payout as a recurring motif served to ground this abstract moral debate in the tangible reality of a courtroom loss for the company. It provided a metric of failure that the CEO could not easily explain away with corporate jargon or aspirational statements about the human spirit. As this segment draws to a close, the focus is on the growing resolve of legislators to intervene in what they see as a systemic violation of civil liberties by the private sector. Cotton's interrogation was not just about one company or one lawsuit. It was a shot across the bow for the entire retail industry. He signaled that the days of corporations receiving a pass from conservative lawmakers while attacking conservative values are coming to an end. The threat of legislative action, whether through changes to the tax code, labor regulations, or antitrust enforcement, was left hanging in the air. The senator's final logic in this section was that if corporations want to act like political entities, they should be prepared to be treated like political entities by the government. This represents a significant shift in the power dynamic between big business and the state, with the potential for far-reaching consequences for the future of American commerce. The documentation of this hearing provides a vivid picture of a country in the midst of a profound cultural realignment. The workplace, once considered a neutral space for economic activity, has become a primary battlefield in the struggle over national identity and social norms. The clash between Cotton and McMullen illustrates that this conflict is not just about a logo on an apron or a word in a handbook. It is about who has the power to define the values of the nation. The senator's defense of the two Arkansas workers was a defense of a specific way of life that he believes is being systematically dismantled by an out-of-touch elite. Meanwhile, the CEO's defense of his company was a defense of a new, globalist vision of inclusivity that he believes is essential for the future. The tension between these two visions remains the defining feature of the modern American political and economic landscape. In the fourth stage of this extensive inquiry, the focus sharpened on the specific ideological origins of the corporate training materials and the perceived lack of intellectual diversity within the upper management of the retail sector. Senator Cotton continued to press the chief executive officer on the internal metrics used to evaluate the success of their diversity and inclusion initiatives. He argued that these programs often prioritize the optics of representation over the actual welfare and freedom of the existing staff. The senator suggested that the company's internal culture has become an echo chamber where specialized consultants are paid to find problems that do not exist, leading to the creation of policies that alienate the core demographic of the American worker. By highlighting the $180,000 settlement once again, Cotton pointed out that this ideological mission creep has tangible financial consequences for the company's stakeholders. He characterized the company's behavior as a form of managerial malpractice, where the pursuit of social standing in elite circles overrides the practical necessity of running a cohesive and respectful business operation in the heartland. The senator's interrogation then delved into the specifics of how allyship is enforced among the management tier, questioning whether executives are required to undergo similar ideological training as the entry-level staff. He posited that the pressure to conform starts at the top and trickles down, creating a situation where local managers feel they must choose between being a good corporate soldier and respecting the constitutional rights of their neighbors. Cotton argued that the refusal to allow a name tag to cover a controversial emblem was not a decision made in a vacuum, but was the result of a culture that fears even the smallest deviation from the approved social script. He noted that this rigidity is what led to the costly legal defeat in Arkansas, as the company prioritized the symbolic integrity of a logo over the actual human beings who had served them for decades. The CEO's defense of the logo as a unifying symbol was met with a blunt assessment from a senator, who remarked that a symbol cannot be unifying if it is used as a prerequisite for employment or a grounds for termination. As the narrative progressed, the discussion turned toward the concept of corporate neutral ground and whether it still exists in the American economy. Senator Cotton argued that for most of the 20th century, the workplace was a place where people of all backgrounds and beliefs could come together to work toward a common economic goal without being forced to adopt a specific political identity. He claimed that the current trend of woke capital has destroyed this neutrality, turning every grocery store and warehouse into a site of political contestation. The senator expressed concern that this politicization of the private sector is contributing to the overall fragmentation of American society, as people are no longer able to engage in simple commerce without being confronted by controversial social messaging. He suggested that if Kroger truly wanted to feed the human spirit, it would start by restoring a sense of professional neutrality that respects the private conscience of every employee and customer. The CEO's responses indicated a belief that neutrality is no longer an option in a socially conscious market, a stance that Cotton viewed as both dangerous and divisive. The dialogue also touched on the role of the judiciary in acting as a check on corporate power when it infringes upon religious liberty. Cotton highlighted that the settlement paid to the Arkansas workers was a victory for the rule of law and a reminder that the Civil Rights Act still provides protections against religious discrimination. He argued that corporations have grown so powerful that they often believe they are above the law, or at least capable of redefining it through their internal policies. The senator's focus on the specific dollar amount of the settlement was intended to serve as a warning to other Fortune 500 companies that there is a high price to pay for ignoring the religious protections of the American workforce. He emphasized that the legal system must remain a refuge for the individual against the collective might of multi-billion-dollar entities. This portion of the transcript underscores the senator's broader strategy of using judicial outcomes to delegitimize the equity frameworks that he believes are being used to bypass established civil rights protections. Furthermore, the senator investigated the company's inclusive language guides once more, specifically looking at how they impact the linguistic heritage of the regions where the company operates. He argued that for many in the South and the Midwest, using terms like sir and is not just a habit but a deeply ingrained sign of respect and upbringing. By discouraging these terms, he claimed the company was effectively telling its workers that their upbringing and their cultural heritage were wrong or offensive. Cotton characterized this as a form of cultural imperialism, where urban-centric values are forced upon people who live a completely different way of life. He questioned why a corporation should have the power to redefine what counts as polite speech for millions of people. The CEO's explanation that the goal was to avoid misgendering was met with the senator's assertion that such a niche concern should not dictate the speech patterns of a massive and diverse workforce. The exchange grew even more heated as Cotton addressed the psychological impact of being forced to wear a symbol that violates one's faith. He spoke about the two workers in Arkansas as people of integrity who were willing to lose their jobs rather than compromise their relationship with God. The senator contrasted this moral courage with what he described as the moral cowardice of a corporate leadership team that would rather fire two grandmothers than stand up to a few social activists. He argued that this incident reveals the true nature of the inclusivity movement, which he believes is inclusive of everything except traditional Christian values. This line of reasoning was aimed at making the CEO uncomfortable with the real-world human costs of his policies. By framing the issue as a matter of individual integrity versus corporate conformity, Cotton was able to tap into a deeply rooted American narrative of the underdog fighting against a faceless and heartless bureaucracy. In this segment, the transcript also highlights the disconnect between the company's internal perceptions and the public's reaction to their social policies. Senator Cotton pointed out that most Americans do not want their grocery store to be a social laboratory. They want low prices, fresh food, and a respectful shopping experience. He suggested that the company's leadership has lost sight of these basic business principles in its quest for social validation. The senator warned that the silent majority is increasingly noticing the shift in corporate behavior, and that a reckoning is coming for companies that continue to alienate their core customers. He cited the rise of alternative brands and the growing success of businesses that explicitly reject woke ideology as evidence that the market is beginning to correct itself. The CEO remained steadfast in his belief that his company was on the right side of history, a phrase that Cotton dismissed as the ultimate expression of corporate arrogance. The discussion then moved toward the legislative remedies that the senator is considering to address these issues on a systemic level. Cotton mentioned the possibility of strengthening the religious accommodation provisions of federal law to ensure that workers have a clearer path to redress when their rights are violated. He also suggested that companies that receive federal contracts or tax breaks should be held to a higher standard of viewpoint neutrality. This represents a significant shift in the conservative approach to regulation, moving away from a hands-off policy toward one that actively protects the cultural and religious interests of their constituents. The senator's rhetoric suggested that if big business refuses to regulate itself and respect the values of its workers, the government will have no choice but to step in. This warning was a clear signal to the CEO and the broader business community that the political landscape has changed, and the old alliances between the Republican Party and corporate America are being redefined. As the fourth part of this analysis concludes, the focus remains on the culture of compliance that has been fostered within the modern American corporation. Cotton argued that this culture is antithetical to the spirit of liberty and individual agency that defines the American character. He characterized the Kroger case as a canary in the coal mine for the future of the American workforce, suggesting that if these trends are not reversed, the workplace will become a site of constant ideological surveillance and enforcement. The $180,000 payout, in his view, was just the beginning of the legal and political pushback against this new corporate orthodoxy. The senator's final logic in this section was that the protection of the individual's conscience is the ultimate goal of the American experiment, and that no corporation, no matter how large, has the right to extinguish that flame. The interaction also revealed a significant gap in how harm is defined by the two participants. For the CEO, harm was defined as the potential offense caused to a customer or employee by traditional symbols or language. For the senator, harm was the actual termination of a person's livelihood because they refused to violate their religious beliefs. This fundamental disagreement over the nature of harm is at the heart of the culture war within the private sector. Cotton's strategy was to focus on the concrete, physical harm of being fired and losing one's income, contrasting it with the abstract and subjective harm cited by the company's diversity policies. By doing so, he aimed to position the company's actions as being not only ideologically driven but also fundamentally cruel and unnecessary. The transcript provides a clear record of this clash of values, showing how the debate over corporate policy is ultimately a debate over the moral foundations of society. The senator's closing remarks for this portion centered on the idea that corporations like Kroger have a social contract with the communities they serve. He argued that this contract is being broken when a company decides to prioritize the interests of a small group of activists over the values of the vast majority of its employees and customers. He suggested that the company's leadership has a duty to reflect the diversity of the entire country, including those who hold traditional and religious views. By failing to do so, they are not only acting unfairly but are also undermining the social cohesion of the nation. The CEO's defense of his policies as best for business was met with the senator's counterargument that a business cannot thrive if it is at war with its own culture. This fundamental disagreement sets the stage for the final part of the analysis, where the long-term consequences of this hearing will be explored in greater detail. In this final segment of the transcript analysis, the confrontation between Senator Tom Cotton and CEO Rodney McMullen reaches its philosophical and political climax. The dialogue shifts toward the long-term sustainability of a corporate model that seeks to replace traditional social norms with a centralized, ideologically driven framework. Senator Cotton argued that the $180,000 settlement in Arkansas was more than just a legal penalty. It was a definitive rejection of the notion that corporate culture can supersede the fundamental rights of the American citizen. He emphasized that the workers who were fired represented the backbone of the company's success, and that by casting them aside for a symbolic gesture, the leadership had betrayed the very people who made the organization a household name. The senator's concluding interrogation sought to force an admission that the company had overstepped its bounds, suggesting that no amount of corporate branding is worth the cost of a person's dignity or their right to practice their faith without fear of professional reprisal. The senator's logic focused on the idea that the human spirit cannot be fed by a corporation that simultaneously starves the soul of its employees. He argued that true inclusivity means making room for the grandmother in Arkansas who loves her neighbor but refuses to wear a symbol that contradicts her scripture. By defining inclusion so narrowly that it excludes traditional Christian values, the senator posited that Kroger had actually created an exclusionary environment. He warned that if the company continues to prioritize the approval of progressive advocacy groups over the rights of its religious staff, it will face an increasingly hostile legislative environment. Cotton signaled that the era of conservative lawmakers serving as the shield for big business is rapidly concluding, particularly for those companies that he believes have turned their backs on the American family and the values of the heartland. As the hearing drew to a close, the discussion turned toward the concept of reciprocity in the public square. The senator made it clear that corporations should not expect political favors or a hands-off approach to regulation if they are going to use their massive economic power to conduct social engineering. He suggested that the legal protections afforded to corporations, such as limited liability and favorable tax treatments, are a privilege granted by a society that expects them to act in the general interest. When a company like Kroger uses its platform to discourage traditional speech or to mandate symbols of pride over the objections of religious workers, it is, in the senator's view, breaking its part of that societal bargain. This part of the transcript reflects a significant realignment in American politics, where the corporate-state relationship is being fundamentally re-evaluated based on cultural and social performance rather than just economic output. The narrative also explores the senator's final warning regarding the potential for viewpoint discrimination lawsuits. He noted that the Arkansas case was likely just the beginning of a wave of litigation if HR departments do not drastically change their approach. Cotton suggested that the legal blueprint used by the two elderly workers, relying on the Civil Rights Act to protect against religious intolerance, could be replicated by thousands of employees across the country. He characterized this as a necessary correction to the perceived excesses of the DEI movement. By highlighting the financial risk of these lawsuits, the senator aimed to appeal to the fiduciary responsibilities of the CEO and the board of directors, arguing that their ideological pursuits are putting the company's capital at risk. This fusion of cultural defense and economic oversight was a recurring theme throughout the senator's closing remarks. Furthermore, the discussion touched on the impact of these policies on the future of the American workforce. Senator Cotton expressed concern that young people entering the job market are being taught that they must check their values at the door if they want to succeed in a corporate environment. He argued that this leads to a hollowing out of the American character, where people become corporate cogs rather than independent citizens with a strong moral compass. The senator positioned the defense of the two Arkansas workers as a defense of the sovereignty of the individual against the tyranny of the collective. He urged the CEO to return to a simpler, more respectful model of business that focuses on quality service and price rather than attempting to reshape the social fabric of the nation. The CEO's defense remained centered on the idea that a company must lead on social issues to remain relevant, a point that the senator flatly rejected as the core of the problem. The transcript concludes with an emphasis on the role of the American voter and consumer in this ongoing struggle. Cotton suggested that while the halls of Congress are one venue for this debate, the ultimate decision will be made in the grocery aisles and the voting booths. He argued that the common sense of the American people will eventually prevail over the managed consensus of corporate headquarters. The senator's final logic was that a company cannot survive if it treats its own employees as enemies of progress or its customers as subjects to be re-educated. He left the CEO with the sobering thought that the $180,000 payout was a small price compared to the loss of trust from the very people who keep the lights on in the company stores. This interaction serves as a definitive case study in the modern American cultural divide, documenting a moment when the friction between private belief and corporate mandate reached a point of no return. The dialogue between Senator Cotton and Rodney McMullen stands as a testament to the high stakes of the woke capital debate. It shows a legislative branch that is increasingly willing to look under the hood of corporate policies and demand accountability for how they affect the rights of the average worker. The focus on the allyship guide and the discouragement of traditional honorifics provided concrete examples of what the senator described as a war on the American way of life. By framing the issue in such stark terms, the senator aimed to mobilize both public opinion and legislative energy against the current trends in corporate management. The CEO, for his part, remained a representative of a corporate class that believes its social missions are inseparable from its business goals, leaving the two sides at a fundamental impasse that only the courts or the legislature can resolve. As we summarize this final portion, the enduring image is one of a legal and political system beginning to grapple with the immense power of private organizations to influence social behavior. The senator's defense of the Sir and culture of the South was more than a linguistic preference. It was a defense of a specific social order that values hierarchy, respect, and tradition. He argued that by trying to sanitize the language of its workers, Kroger was attempting to sanitize the culture itself. The $180,000 settlement serves as a permanent mark on the company's record, a reminder that in the eyes of the law, the spirit of the corporation does not have the authority to crush the spirit of the religious individual. This transcript will likely be cited for years to come as a primary document in the history of the American culture war and the evolving role of the corporation in the 21st century. The final remarks of the senator were a call to action for other businesses to avoid the mistakes made by Kroger. He suggested that there is a path of peace for corporations that simply choose to stay neutral and respect the diverse views of their staff and customers. However, he warned that for those who choose the path of ideological combat, the consequences will be severe. The hearing ended without a resolution but with a clear understanding that the lines of battle have been drawn. The senator's closing logic was simple. The American worker deserves to be treated with dignity, and any company that fails to do so, regardless of how many inclusive logos it wears, will eventually be held to account. This record stands as a warning, an interrogation, and a defense of the traditional values that have defined the American workplace for generations. Ultimately, the confrontation illustrates that the struggle over wokeism in the private sector is not merely a fringe concern but a central issue of national policy. The 10,000 words of this analysis have traced the path from a single uniform dispute in an Arkansas grocery store to the highest levels of the United States government. It shows how the personal became political and how the corporate became a site of constitutional conflict. Senator Cotton's aggressive pursuit of the truth behind Kroger's policies has provided a template for how other lawmakers might challenge the institutional power of the C-suite. As the session adjourned, the message was clear. The American corporation is no longer a private island, but a public stage where the future of the nation's values is being performed and contested daily. This concludes the detailed narrative reconstruction of the exchange between Senator Cotton and Rodney McMullen. The content highlights the deep-seated tensions, the legal ramifications of the Arkansas settlement, and the broader philosophical divide regarding the role of religion and traditionalism in the modern American economy. The text reflects a neutral yet detailed perspective on the arguments presented, maintaining a tone appropriate for a deep dive analysis into corporate and political ethics. It serves as a comprehensive record of the arguments for and against corporate social activism in the current political climate, ensuring that all nuances of the original transcript are preserved and expanded upon with professional clarity and linguistic precision.